Good morning or good afternoon to those who are joining us from the East Coast, and welcome to FSMA Fridays. One day prior to Halloween, lots to talk about. Today's discussion will be a continuation from our September session where we were diving into the preventive controls for human and animal food. Since the final rules had just come out, there was lots of activity, lots of questions, so absolutely merited continuing that conversation. And with today, we'll focus a little bit more on supply chain environmental monitoring, distribution centers, and certainly a lot more, and we'll welcome many questions. Before we get started, let's go ahead and just go through our quick housekeeping tips, as we always do. My name is Jill Bender, hosting today's session with Safety Chain Software. Before we begin, reminders, we always send recording links to FSMA Fridays, and you'll receive that on Monday. Any questions you'd like to submit, you have to be online. Go ahead and submit those questions in the Q&A tab. For your privacy, we always only show the panelists, but as suspected, quite the crowd is joining us here. And more importantly, if you have trouble hearing the audio, if you're logged in via your speakers, there is a conference number which will be much more clear if you're having trouble hearing this. So as always, with our agenda, we will go through a couple pre-submitted questions, and then we'll give you a quick overview on how TAG and Safety Chain can help you with FSMA, and more importantly, get to all the questions. So with that, I am delighted as always to have Dr. David Acheson on the call with us this morning. Good morning, David.
Good morning, Jill.
And then also I'm delighted to have Melanie Newman back, also with the Acheson group. She's been very much a part of FSMA Fridays, and delighted to have you on with us as well, Melanie.
Good morning, Jill. Good morning, everyone. So glad to be back.
Great. Well, let's go ahead and get started. David, why don't you kick us off and share with us the latest FSMA update?
Yeah, sure, Jill. Well, nothing hot off the press. Obviously, we're waiting for the next round of rules to come out. I think the only update that I'd give, and Melanie can certainly add to this, was the FDA had a public meeting recently, and she was there along with another one of our colleagues from TAG, and it was the subject of one of our recent newsletters. I also had the opportunity to actually do a presentation with Jenny Scott in Washington just recently, and you know, I think the updates from FDA are really now focused on the guidances for these rules. And the promise is of lots of guidances coming out, which I think is going to be very helpful. And I just want to add, I think, a note of realism to that, and that with moving final rules through and with the guidance documents, I think very clearly having to have clearance, not just with FDA, but with department as well, HHS and OMB, because of them all being tied to FSMA. I think they may take a little while before they come out. So we may be managing without guidances. I think the other interesting opportunity that's come up, again, this is something that Jenny's mentioned, is FDA, CFSAN have now set up a sort of a hotline. Actually, it's a lukewarm line, I think, rather than a hotline, because it's an inquiry line, and I call it a lukewarm line because when asked what the average response turnaround time will be on that for questions, and it's for people to send in their FSMA questions to FDA and make them as specific as you can, so that they can help you interpret the rules. She's promising turnarounds in 2 to 3 weeks. So a somewhat hotline, but at least there's an access port into FDA to get questions answered. So. And a little plug for TAG there, if you've got questions on FSMA, we will turn them around a heck of a lot faster than 2 to 3 weeks. So anyway, that's our update. Let's get into the juice here, Jill.
Okay, great. Actually, could you just share one more update? And I believe everyone is aware of this, of when the next set of rules are being finalized. I believe tomorrow, right? We have a final due date.
Yeah, well, yeah, we have a final due date, but the other ones took a little while before they actually kicked out. But I think we'll see something, if I had to guess, a week to 10 days, we'll get those final rules out on at least produce foreign supply verification program. Third-party audit, I'm not exactly sure whether that might lag behind a little bit. It might, but obviously foreign supply verification program and produce will be two big ones that hopefully we'll be talking about a month from now on the next FSMA Friday.
Okay, great. So instant response versus lukewarm waiting. Perfect. So let's go ahead and dive in as we're chatting. And David, let's go ahead and have you continue the dialogue here. The next question, what are the main challenges the industry is facing with the Preventive Control Rule implementation?
Yeah, I think this is obviously individual, facility, industry, group specific. But some of the things that I'm seeing, just talking to people, is trying to understand how to put together what they've already got, their HACCP plans and their prerequisite programs, and sort of stitch them together into an overall food safety plan. I think that's one of the challenges. We've talked about that a fair bit, that HARP-C isn't exactly HACCP. So that's definitely a challenge of how to build that together and what to be ready to show FDA when they come into a plant to inspect. I think another challenge that folk are having is the record keeping part of this, is the recognition that they've got to keep a lot of new records and just exactly how to do it. Another challenge is on the supply chain control part. The good news there is that FDA has given everybody a little longer to be compliant with that piece. But I think that's raising a lot of questions. And then another challenge is as certainly some groups, and this is very specific to certain entities, are looking at the exemptions, particularly around the secondary farms. There's definitely, I think, a lot of anxiety there where certainly, for example, in the nut industry, there's hullers of nuts who previously really didn't need to worry about any of this, have suddenly found that they can't designate themselves as secondary farms. And it's got nothing to do with risk, it's got to do with who owns them, which, as I'm sure most on the call will remember, the secondary farm issue is tied somewhat to the ownership angle of the place. So those are just some of the challenges, just at a very high level. We're going to dig into a couple of those in just a second with some of the pre-submitted questions. So let's just plow on, Jill, and get into some of these in a bit more depth.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. And Melanie, why don't we turn the conversation over to you, and why don't you, if you could, share us a little bit about what is the best approach to supply chain control compliance?
Great. Thanks, Jill. And thanks for having me back. It's good to be back with everybody. And thanks for everyone who's dialed in. You know, David mentioned that we get a little bit longer to comply with some of the supply chain control requirements under the final rule and the final requirements. But don't wait. Start now. That's something that we've been espousing the whole time, even when we were under the proposed rule before the Preventive Controls Rule became final. And that message doesn't change because there's a lot to this, and there's a lot behind supply chain control compliance. So really, I mean, we could talk a whole entire FSMA Friday session on this topic, and what I'd love to just point out to everybody is check out subpart G of the final rule. There's your roadmap, point blank. That's really where the rubber meets the road with respect to this program. And check it out, because first you really need to determine whether or not you need to comply with subpart G and need this type of program, and then start the process of developing the program. On the highest level, subpart G of the rule basically states that the receiving facility needs to establish and implement a risk-based supply chain program for raw materials and other ingredients that the receiving party has identified as a hazard requiring a supply chain applied control. Now, does that sound like I read a part of the rule to you just now? Yeah, it just does sound scripted, but we've got to start somewhere to try to understand, where do I start? And that's where you start. You start there and you start at subpart G, and then you have to ask yourself a really important question before you can move on with complying with this requirement. And guess what that is, folks? It's who the heck is in my supply chain? And what hazards or the products that they're shipping me present to me in my facility? You'd be really surprised how many companies don't know the answer to this fundamental question, and you've got to start there. A lot of companies have done a great job of really doing a good risk assessment of what risks do my suppliers present me and what risks do the products that they ship me present me. Other companies still have kind of a one-size-fits-all, rather cookie-cutter kind of approach. And we've got to move away from that because the rule now is telling us in black and white it needs to be a risk-based program. And that's one of the things that I think if you're listening, to any takeaway nugget at all, risk-based program on your supply chain program. And then we just need to look back to the rule for guidance as to how to build it. Look to that subpart G, particularly 117.410, and that'll give you your roadmap. You need to have a process for approving suppliers, use your approved suppliers, and determine appropriate verification activities. If you've got a hazard that requires a preventive control that presents a serious adverse health consequence or death, for example, you need an on-site audit. Yes, you can accept third-party audits, or you can do your own on-site audit. If you don't have risks of that significant hazard or degree, you can do sampling, testing, review records, things of that nature. So does it sound a bit complicated? It can be, and that's the message of don't wait. Start tackling subpart G on the supplier compliance programs now, because this is just scratching the surface, quite frankly, Jill.
Okay, great. And I'm having this image of everyone online like frantically now trying to find Part G. But again, I believe everything's posted on the tax site, right, the actual document, and we'll send that out in the post emails that go out about this session. So thank you, Melanie. Let's go ahead and move on to our next question. And David, I'll go ahead and ask you to take this. So we talked about HACCP and what should we be doing with the current HACCP plan. I know that this has been touched on in the past with past sessions.
Yeah, no, thanks, Jill. We have touched on it a fair bit. And as I mentioned earlier, it is one of the things that I think a lot of companies are struggling with. And the point here, the FDA has made it very clear, is everything that's in your HACCP plan, assuming it's an appropriate one and it's a good one, is all still totally valid. It's all good, because the HACCP principles of identifying risks that are reasonably likely to occur is parallel, at least to the thinking in general of HARP-C. But as I've said in the past, HARP-C just takes you a little further. So if you've got a good HACCP plan and you've identified critical control points, undoubtedly they will all roll into your food safety plan, no question about that. But remember, with each of those CCPs, just like HACCP and maybe beyond, you'll need to set the parameters, which you'll do for your HACCP program. You'll need in your food safety plan to write what your corrective actions would be. You need to make sure that those preventive controls in the HACCP plan are validated in terms of process controls. You'd have to have monitoring systems, and again, describe how you're going to do that, and what's going to happen if there's a deviation. So corrective actions and all of that. So I think the key thing is that your HACCP plan is going to be very valuable to you. The challenge here is just remembering that it's not enough, number one, and to look at the other risks in the system, particularly, as Melanie said very clearly, the supply chain risks which need to be built in, and then obviously the environmental controls, which we've also talked about before, looking to see whether you fit into that group where you'll need environmental controls, and look at those as well as allergen controls. So that's the key thing. I think the final point I'd mentioned, and just to reiterate, is FDA has said, the rule says, and I think it's very clear, is don't be looking to put critical control points on all sorts of new things where they don't really fit. There's absolutely no expectation that you will have classic HACCP-type CCPs in all sorts of new places. You've got them already, use them. You'll have other areas where you just say, yeah, we found a risk that requires a preventive control, and then you institute that preventive control along with, as I said, the monitoring, the corrective actions, and the record keeping to go with it. So that's the, not exactly in a nutshell, but hopefully that makes sense to people, is hang on to your HACCP plan, use it, leverage it, but you're really just going to build off it somewhat into building the full-blown HARP-C plan, food safety plan. You still there?
Yep. No, thank you, David. Yep. No, I was just sort of coming back to saying, yep, coming back to the asset plan being the foundation. I think you've said that before. So that's good to reiterate. Let's move on with Melanie in regards to record keeping and what are the new requirements and what's the best way to approach?
Wow, that is the million-dollar question.
Yes.
Jill, I will say, and I will start by saying, if there's going to be one area of these new rules that is going to trip a good company up, it's going to be record keeping and documentation. So I'll start there. And if you don't have a really solid program or mechanism to keep your records, take a look at enhancing that now. There are some really good companies who have really great practices in place and are doing everything right, but it's the record keeping that is the weakest link. They may keep all of their records on paper manually. It takes them a really long time to dig those records up. Be able to produce and show that they're doing everything right, and they've got all of their process controls documented, recorded, monitored correctly and in the proper fashion and the proper time frames and frequencies, so on and so forth. So look to technology to manage and leverage your risk, to leverage that and to manage your risk, because if you can't produce these documents and these records in a quick, prompt period of time, that's one of the expectations. So just kind of getting back to what are the requirements, for example, first of all, you can store your records off-site. We've got a lot of companies or a lot of particularly production facilities who are cramped for space. And you can keep your records off-site as long as you can produce them within 24 hours. So off-site does mean electronic. You can keep them in the cloud. You can keep them in other electronic software applications and means, for example. But you've got to be able to produce those in 24 hours. So that goes back to the, can you put your finger on those manual documents and be able to produce in that period of time? Because now we've got more and more records that we've got to be able to produce. You've got to be able to track and document corrective actions and monitoring and verification of your preventive controls and all of the training that goes and is associated with training your preventive controls qualified individual and your qualified individual and produce all of that. And that's, those are new requirements that we haven't really had to produce before, even though a lot of us have been tracking, at least on some level, some training programs. So now we've got exponentially more records we've got to keep and document, be able to produce in 24 hours. And pretty soon that filing cabinet or that shoebox that we're keeping those paper documents in is starting to explode. So electronic record keeping and documentation is one of the approaches to really consider as we're going into this era of new records, because then we've got supply chain related documents that we've got to be able to keep, produce, track, be able to put our finger on the pulse of with regard to the supplier verification expectations as well. So those are some things to consider as well. You don't have to keep all your documents in one place. That's the good news. But it's very encouraged by the rule and also just from a practicality perspective to keep a table of contents so you know where they all are. So if you've got your sanitation records in one area of a plant and your allergen management records in another, keep a table of contents. And then a couple of just really practical tips, folks. One is leveraging your technology, and number two, especially those of you who are larger companies out there who have a lot of different facilities around, whether domestically or otherwise, have a cover story. And I know that sounds bad, like you're covering something up, but I mean it in a very good way. Empower your facility QA managers to be able to tell a good story when those inspectors show up. So, for example, if an inspector shows up and they ask, what is your supplier verification program? How are you controlling your suppliers? And their answers start to sound something like, I don't know, I'm not really sure how we do that here, or if we do that here. That doesn't start to instill a lot of confidence in the inspector. So if you have a cover story that starts to explain for your QA managers in bullet points how certain things are handled in your company, especially when they're not handled on site at that plant facility, and it's subject to one of the preventive controls requirements, like supplier verification, that's really going to help them be able to talk and speak intelligently about these types of things when inspections happen. So, for example, they can say, hey, we're not even going to be able to receive this ingredient at our dock door unless it's gone through a vetted supplier approval program. Or better yet, we do scan-based receiving, and I can't scan it in. It will be locked out because it hasn't gone through the proper supplier approval program at corporate. And those talking points can really empower them. So that's another way to leverage a record to help you be FSMA compliant. So those are just some of the tips that I've got for you with regard to records and some of the record keeping requirements. All the records under FSMA are required to be kept for 2 years. And with that, just don't underestimate the power of the record and the power of records to be able to trip you up in an inspection. Back to you, Jill.
Okay, great. Thanks, Melanie. And of course, you know, representing Safety Chain, I'll say the power of a automated system to help out with that. Let's go ahead and move on to our next question. And David, I'm going to come back to you on this. What is the best approach? Now we're going to move over now to looking a bit more at environmental control programs. So what is the best approach to developing an environmental control program?
Yeah, this is again is one of the challenges I think for a lot of food companies as they're looking at FSMA, because many companies have them, but the FSMA requirement to make it a focused part of your food safety plan is making folks nervous. This question, if we look at it literally, Jill, is talking about environmental control program, and that's broader than an environmental monitoring program. So I think the key part for my way of thinking, and obviously this is a webinar in and of itself, and we talked about this before somewhat, is when you're looking at environmental controls, first question would be, which environment do you want to control, and are they all the same? And obviously the purpose of these programs fundamentally from a FSMA perspective is keeping bad bugs out of ready-to-eat food, and FDA is obviously focused on salmonella and listeria. So if our whole mission here from a compliance perspective is to keep those two or others, and obviously infant formula, you worry about other things, but keeping bad bugs out of food. And then our environmental control program needs to be looked at from one end of the plant to the other. The way we're controlling the environment in raw areas will be different from ready-to-eat areas. And that gets to the fundamental principles of hygienic zoning, of controlling traffic, vehicles, equipment, food, air handling, drains, all of those things that can encourage microbes to be traveling from what one may deem microbially hot areas like raw areas into the ready-to-eat areas. So controlling that whole component is a critical part of managing the risk, obviously linked with a really good cleaning and sanitation program. And Melanie just gave a great overview of record keeping, and my view is that since this has been such a hot topic, environmental contamination, FDA is very focused on it. And we're continuing to see recalls and illnesses linked to environmental contamination all the time. So this is definitely a program that you need in place just to protect your brand. I think FDA will focus on this pretty heavily. People often ask me, what's FDA going to look at when they come into my plant to do their first FSMA visits? And this will be one of them. This will be, I think this is where I'd go. Show me your environmental control program. And then obviously, the next piece to all of that, you built the program, is the environmental monitoring. And FDA has not been and won't be prescriptive on what they see as an adequate number of samples. As a rule of thumb, which I've heard them say, but that they don't write it down, is if you're working on the basic principle of 10 samples per line per week, you won't be far off right. Obviously, you need to vary that upwards or downwards, driven by risk. And as I said, environmental monitoring, environmental controls is a whole webinar in and of itself. But be thinking seek and destroy. Be thinking looking at those key places with harborage. And then as we saw big time with the Bluebell episode with the ice cream, is that when you find something, treat it appropriately and go digging into root cause. If you need to institute corrective actions, do so. Keep vectoring, keep looking, keep hunting, seeking and destroying. That's what FDA expects us to do. And I really do honestly believe that they expect us to find positives. It makes everybody really nervous when they do, because they'll say, oh, well, you know, they'll get linked to other data and there'll be problems. But I think FDA will say, well, you've taken 1,000 swabs in the last month and you haven't found a single positive. Where are you looking? As opposed to finding a couple of positives in zone 3 and zone 4 areas, managing them accordingly and keeping them where they belong on the periphery of the ready-to-eat areas. So complex area, but I think this is an important question because I do see it as a focus of the regulators when they start to do FSMA-based food safety plan inspections in September next year. So more to come on this one, I'm sure, Jill. I think we should probably plan down the road to do a full-blown FSMA Friday on this one. But that's just a quick overview.
Okay, great. Thanks, David. And yes, I wrote webcast in bullets next to that question because I absolutely think that this is merited for something just on this. Okay, in the interest of time, let's go ahead and move on to the next question. And Melanie, I'll ask you to take this. GFSI certification. I have one. Am I all set with preventive control rule compliance?
You know, great question, and I've got some promising news for you folks, but a word of warning, so just please hear the whole answer, not just the parts you want to hear. So the final rule does acknowledge that to the extent that your existing HACCP plan, as David mentioned, or your GFSI compliant food safety plan includes, quote, all required information, end quote, your facility might be able to use that plan to meet the requirements of the rule. So what does that mean? You really need to lay down your GFSI compliant food safety plan against the requirements of the food safety plan requirements under the Preventive Controls Rule to make sure it has it all. But yeah, the short answer is you might be able to use that GFSI food safety plan and meet all of the Preventive Controls Rule requirements. But don't take it at face value. Do a double check. That's really what you're going to need to do. If you do find any gaps, you can just supplement it. Just fill in the blanks, fill in the gaps, and then you're there. So the beauty of the final rule is it really brought a lot of clarity to the fact that whether you're going to leverage your HACCP plan or your GFSI compliant food safety plan, you can rely on those existing records and you can just supplement it as you need to in order to demonstrate compliance with the Preventive Controls final rule. I will note that I've done an in-depth comparison of GFSI's benchmark guidance document as well as several of the scheme owners' schemes, and there's not a lot of gaps. There's not a lot of variances between the certifications and FSMA's final or FSMA's preventive controls rules. So that's the good news, but you need to still do a one-for-one within your plan and the final rule to make sure there aren't gaps in your facility because these plans need to be facility specific.
Okay, great. Thanks, Melanie. And again, from a broader standpoint, you know, we've been hosting this Safety Chain series with GFSI in alignment with FSMA, and it so happens here in a half hour we'll be chatting with BRC about how they align or what the gaps are from their scheme to FSMA. So I just want to let folks know about that. So moving on to the last question of our pre-submitted questions, and this is something that came up a few times, so I'm glad to see this up here question-wise. David, if you could advise, regards to the animal rule specifically, I send scraps for my plant for animal feed. Do I need to comply with the animal rule, and what do I need to do?
Great question. Comes up a lot and is very relevant to a lot of companies that make human foods. I think the short answer to this is no, you don't. But you do need to comply with a few elements. The fundamental principle that FDA has put out there is that if, assuming your human food production plant is compliant with the Preventive Control Rule and meeting all applicable CGMP requirements, that pretty much is what you will need to do. Those CGMP requirements will pertain to some degree to the byproducts. But as we discussed before, what FDA is particularly worried about is protecting those byproducts from physical and chemical contaminants, recognizing that microbiological contamination for animal feed is not nearly the risk that it would be for human foods. So assuming that you've got your CGMPs in place and you're paying attention to that, you don't need to put together a food safety plan that's focused on the animal feed specifically. Just to call out a couple of specific things that the FDA wants us to do, which sort of gets to this CGMP part of the scraps, is that you've got to hold any of the scraps under conditions that are going to protect against contamination. And they specifically call out the appropriate containers. They need to be in appropriate containers made of appropriate material. They say they need to be cleaned as necessary without obviously being prescriptive as to what that means. And maintain to protect against contamination with trash, which gets to my earlier point. They don't want situations where the animal feed bin is in a place where workers are just dumping plastic and used gloves and bits of wire and string. So there needs to be some level of protection there, and they have to be accurately identified. So if it's animal feed, it needs to be labeled as such, and so it's clear to everybody that that's what it is. If you're using particular shipping containers for animal waste, human food going to animal waste, then you've just got to make sure that they are looked at before you use them, just to ensure that they can't become contaminated. So obviously looking for rusts, looking for holes, looking for problems with them, looking for lids that don't seal. I think that's what they'll be looking for. And I do see this as a bit of an Achilles heel for some human food companies because it tends to get just forgotten and not worried about. And this too might be a bit of a focus for the inspector when they come in. And I could see, even though it's minimal risk, I could see 483 start to fly around because human food companies haven't just paid attention to this appropriate use of containers, making sure that trash isn't in there and properly labeled. Simple little things that can that just keep you out of trouble. And it sends a very strong message to the inspector that, yep, I've read the rule, I know what I'm doing, and I've got this part stitched up. It's really quite simple. And again, you won't need to worry about developing an animal feed-based food safety plan. So with that, Jill, hopefully we've got time for a few other questions that have come in.
From the audience. Okay, great. Thank you so much. And yes, so this is a time where we are going to take some questions. I see some have already come in the Q&A tab, so thank you very much. A few more coming in. So right before we get to those questions, because I know a few people do have to log off, I just wanted to share a few things in regards to TAG as well as safety chain. We get questions all the time after these sessions. How can we meet what we need to do for FSMA, and how can we ensure compliance? And we're just going to offer up, and as we have in the past, that the Acheson group, the TAG group, can absolutely help you understand FSMA. Let them help you. They've done data dives, let them help you figure it out. They could set up a short personal Q&A session on how FSMA impacts you, help you build the food safety plan, leveraging what you already have, as well as what to have ready for FDA when they ask to see your food safety plan, as we sort of discussed today, and go over a few other things as well. So we do have a specific contact if you'd like to start talking to Acheson Group and what it would be to engage with them to help you out, and we'll go ahead and send that in the follow-up email. And then also just as a follow-up, sort of chiming into what Melanie was talking about as far as not getting tripped up on your record keeping, and that's certainly where Safety Chain could come into play, just with overall food safety and quality automation management, ensuring your FSMA compliance, whether it's your vendor approval program management, supply chain controls, program automation with HARP-C and HAPSA, as well as, more importantly, having that central repository of records upstream, internally, downstream for audit readiness. And we touched a little bit on continuous improvement and keeping that cycle going of always trying to improve your processes. So with that, those are two very solid options for you all to start talking to us about FSMA compliance, and we're going to dive into some of these questions. I think the one that I will throw out there very quickly, because it's come up a few times, I know, David, with the last session, people were asking, where can we see the final rules that came out, and you graciously put them on your website. And is that something that you can do for the next rules that come out, as well as a link for that lukewarm line that you talked about earlier?
Yeah, I'll pay for that statement. I know that FDA will be, they'll get me for saying it's a lukewarm hotline. But hopefully it's putting a smile on a few people's faces on a Friday lunchtime. Yeah, no, absolutely. We will most certainly do that. As soon as they come out, we'll pop them up there on our main page for sure. And if I could just reiterate your point, Jill, we at TAG are developing a lot of new programs to help people become compliant with FSMA and getting into which rules apply to me and what do I do and how do you build a food safety plan, and our new contact at the TAG will be out there. And if you've got questions or needs on FSMA from TAG, then reach out to lindsay.nix@achesongroup.com, and Lindsay will be back in touch with you and help you figure out how TAG can help you. And yeah, we will be a hotline, not a lukewarm one, Jill. So yeah.
Well, we'll definitely make sure that email's in, her email address is in the post-session email for sure. Let's see, a couple other quick questions, please. Martha is asking, what kind of training do you foresee being available to show that the qualified individual administering the food safety program has been appropriately trained? And I don't know, David or Melanie.
I can take that one, Jill. Since I was at the FDA meeting in Chicago last week, there was quite a bit of discussion on that, and the Food Safety Preventive Control Alliance is doing a lot of work with developing the curriculum in conjunction with FDA, and there was presentation by them on it and so forth. So that curriculum should be just about launched. They're doing a train the trainer protocol right now and training lead instructors, and then it's going to be rolled out from there. So the Food Safety Preventive Controls Alliance website would be a great place to find information. They've got an outline of what that curriculum is going to look like, and that would be your best bet to find out more information about what that training will be revealed shortly.
Yeah, if I just add one little other thought to that, and what Melanie said is absolutely dead on, because it gets to this question that has come up often, is does FDA expect us to do that training? And Melanie's absolutely right. This is going to be, I think, a great training resource. It's going to be there. And I think my thoughts on that is they absolutely don't mandate it. They do make it very clear that you can be trained through a recognized program, which is exactly what this will be, or through experience. But again, a comment that I've heard FDA leadership make is, well, the training course gives you a good grounding in FSMA and it will cover all the topics. So my sort of default reaction here is if these training programs come out and they are reasonably doable, then have folk doing them. It's just going to check that box. It's not going to leave you in any doubt. But they're not mandated, but I think FDA will just feel better if people have done them. But let's just sort of see how accessible they are and how quick and easy they are, and frankly, what they're going to cost.
Okay, great. Thank you. Let me go ahead and take, it looks like we might have time for just one more, and then we'll hold the rest for next session, next FSMA Fridays. One question in regards to GMPs. Do you believe we need to produce records supporting GMPs, as it's not called out in the regulations?
What a great question. You know, I think one of the things in that FSMA has done is it's put GMPs in as regulatory requirements. Subpart B in the human rule is that's what it's all about. And there's tons and tons and tons and tons of detail in there. I'd be interested in what Melanie thinks about this for record keeping, but my instincts are absolutely have records of your GMPs. I don't know from a purely legal perspective whether you could be written up on a 483 if you don't have them, because arguably they are not part of your direct food safety plan. But I would strongly recommend that you've got records that support your GMP activities. I think it could stand you in really good stead from in all sorts of other ways, not just regulatory compliance, but legal action against you should there be a food safety issue, that you've got it all tied up and documented. But Melanie, what do you see of that from a legal angle?
Yeah, I would agree with you, David. I question a bit as far as the length of exercising enforcement authority that could be weighed upon you. But, part of the GMPs goes to training a bit, and now there is the expectation and the requirements for training. And so there is starting to become a bit of a bridge and an argument that can be made that the record keeping within the GMPs is now more critical and more important. So, to David's point, err on the side of keeping those records, being able to produce those records with respect to the GMP and GMP compliance, because there's some crossover. There's crossover now with, for example, allergen management within the rule and into the GMPs. And so why split hairs? Document everything. If it's not documented, it didn't happen. And if a GMP is a part of a, bridging into something that, is going to be critical to controlling a risk potentially, then it's way better to have it documented than not. So I would just roll it up into your overall total food safety and quality management program that should be documented anyways as far as just good industry practice.
Okay, great. And with that, I am going to go ahead and wrap up today's session. And if we didn't get to your questions, I will absolutely keep them in a good record for next month. Just a couple quick things as we wrap up today's session. First, just a huge call out, of course, to David and Melanie. Thank you for continuing to provide informative insights in real time. This is always super informative, and I know our audience appreciates it, so thank you to both. Also, just a reminder, today's session will be recorded, as it always is, and be sent out by close of business on Monday. A few other things at Safety Chain. As I mentioned, we have our GFSI Leadership Series, GFSI in the Age of FSMA. BRC is coming up here in about 15 minutes, and FSSC will be in next month. Also, a couple of events that I know we'll both be at, both TAG and Safety Chain, SQF Conference and the Food Safety Consortium. And then also with TAG, do go onto their website. Quite a bit of great information and trainings and so forth that you could find. The next one looks like November 11th on FSMA specific and how to contact us for more information. So with that, thank you for everyone for joining us, and thank you again, both to David and Melanie, for continuing to educate us and keep the dialogue moving.